Everybody's time. I am Greta Haas, the IAR Government Affairs Director, and also serve as our Diversity Committee staff liaison at the state level. I want to thank you for joining us today. Last week marked the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this was some vital legislation that protects people with disabilities from discrimination across the country. We're so excited to partner with the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement to offer this special class to you today, discussing how disability affects our personal and our professional lives. So today we are so fortunate to be joined by Daniel Van Sant, a disability rights attorney who has practiced most extensively in the areas of inclusive education, gender-based violence, and inclusive international development. Daniel works on disability inclusion in many spheres across many locations. He draws on his personal and professional experiences with disability in leading the disability work at the Harkin Institute at Drake University. The Harkin Institute at Drake was founded on the premise that good public policy is best achieved when policymakers have access to high-quality information, political processes are open and well understood, and citizens are informed and active participants, and the belief that good public policy requires communication, collaboration, and courtesy from everyone involved. This belief underlies the Harkin Institute's 5 core values of inclusion, education, respect, accessibility, and opportunity. We're so fortunate to have Daniel with us here today to present on the value proposition of disabled homeownership. Just as a quick reminder and housekeeping, make sure that to receive credit for this class, that your first and last name appear on your Zoom screen and that you keep your camera on at all times. So with that, I want to thank you again for joining us. And Daniel, I will turn it over to you.
Before you do that, my photo is still not up there. And I want credit for the class. I don't know why it's not coming up.
Tim, I'll take care of you. I'm trying to work on it. You're fine. No worries.
And my name doesn't show up on mine.
Okay, I'll work on it as we're going along in the class. Thank
Okay.
you.
If you have any issues, just drop it in the chat and Dottie and I can help take care of that. All right, thanks, Daniel. It's all you.
Sure. Thanks, Greta. Can people hear me okay? Okay, I got some thumbs up. Hopefully you all see the background slide here of the value proposition of disabled homeownership. If someone is not seeing that, put something in the chat so we can try to triage that. I see that the captions have been enabled, so you should have access to the captioning for this webinar. Great. Well, Greta already took a lot of the introduction remarks on her own, so I'll kind of go through some of the beginning pretty quickly here. But my name is Daniel. I'm excited to talk with all of you today. As Greta mentioned, last week was the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so having presentations like this is a really important part of making sure that the ADA continues to grow and spread. And we'll talk a little bit about how it does and maybe does not apply to real estate a little bit later. But I want to thank you all for having me. Right, the fact that you're having this conversation already shows things are going in a pretty good direction for us being just over 3 decades out from the ADA. So I'll scroll down a little bit here. This is a rough breakdown of what you can expect on today's presentation. I've got this scheduled to last just about an hour, so hopefully we can stick to that. My hope is to get through all of the information and then leave some time at the end for questions. Hopefully my timing allows me to do that. Personally, I'm happy to stay a little bit later to answer questions if people want to stick around. I'm also available outside of this webinar if people want to email me or get in touch. But for this purpose of making sure everybody gets their hour of credit, I'm going to try to keep everything and then we can go over for questions if there's an interest. So as Greta said, we'll be breaking down a little bit of what is a disability, what is the disability market share, why does it matter, why do you need training on this, or why did you seek out training on disability? We get a lot of questions about how disability fits into broader diversity, equity, and inclusion work, so we'll talk a little bit about that. It would not be a professional training if we didn't dive a little bit into the law and policies. And we'll talk about how the ADA applies to real estate companies. What are some of the benefits for you, either as an employer or in sales, or working on making your space ready for customers who have disabilities. We'll do a little bit of where do we go from here? What are some resources you can point to? And then, like I said, we will hopefully have time for questions within the hour. So Greta already talked a lot about what the Harkin Institute is, so I won't belabor this point too much. We were founded in 2013 by now retired Senator Tom Harkin, who, as many of you probably know, is a long-time serving senator and representative for Iowa, representing Iowa for about 4 decades or 40 years, which is a tremendous career in public service for any elected official. When he retired, he opened up the Harkin Institute to sort of carry on that work. And so, as Greta said, we work in a few different areas of public policy that were really important to him and his legislative legacy. A couple things that I want to highlight is that we are nonpartisan. So even though Senator Harkin, of course, held a partisan office, we are not partisan. We don't do anything political down party lines. We really want to find best practices and policy solutions, regardless of what letter comes after the politician who put it forward. We're also nonprofit. So I'm sure all of you know how those different delineations work, but nonpartisan, nonprofit, sort of a think tank, if you will, trying to pass and move along information on best public policy outcomes. There are 4 areas that we work in. Today's focus, of course, will be on people with disabilities because I am our director of disability policy. That's within my wheelhouse here. We also have staff like me who work in retirement security, which is a little bit more like financial literacy, enabling people to retire when they are ready to, wellness and nutrition, and then labor and employment, which focuses on labor rights, unions, things like that. A little background about me. As Greta mentioned, I am an attorney. I worked in private practice before taking this position here at the Harkin Institute a couple of years ago. But I always have to have that sort of disclaimer, right? All of you probably work with lawyers. Some of you probably are also lawyers. You work with our people all the time. You know that I have to have a disclaimer or it wouldn't be a lawyer talk, right? So I am an attorney, but I'm not your attorney, right? I cannot give any of you legal advice as an individual or as a business, as an entity. So even though I will talk about disability laws and the ADA in general applications, I can't in a webinar like this tell you, yes, you can do that, or, oh, this doesn't apply in your situation because of XYZ. So if you have those questions, of course, you should seek out your own legal counsel. You likely already have someone that you're working with. Again, I know that's probably something you all know, but if I didn't have that slide, people will say, oh, this attorney at the Harkin Institute told me I can do this. And it gets into the weeds really quickly there. So the primary law that we're going to talk about today is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Again, last week it turned 33 years old. So think of that in terms of the timeline of, I guess, American history, for lack of a better term. I mean, it's only about 3 decades old that we had a federal civil rights law for people with disabilities. So think about, many of us here are older than 33. So think about in your lifetime not having civil rights protections for one of the largest minority groups in the country and around the world. So just in terms of where we are and where we're going, a lot has improved in the last 33 years, but there's still a lot of room to grow. And obviously, we're still giving presentations like this showing that there's a need to spread the information. What we'll talk about mostly today are Title I and Title III, which you'll see highlighted here because they are at least the most readily applicable to you as real estate agents, brokers, Generally, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in all areas of public life. So employment, schools, transportation, public-private places of accommodation. The focus here for you will be employment. So Title I, think of that as you as the employer, right? So you are hiring people in your staff. This is your place of work, or I suppose you could be the employee. I don't know everyone's capacity here. So Title I is you're hiring people with disabilities, or you have a disability and you're getting hired. So that's our Title I space. Title III, public accommodations. This is sort of a legal term of art. Again, lawyers wouldn't be good at their job if they didn't make things slightly confusing so that we'd have to get paid to explain it. Here, accommodations does not mean like a workplace accommodation, which we will talk about later. It means a public space that anyone of the general public can go into. So we'll talk about that briefly later on in the presentation, but think about your office space here. So if a client or someone can just come in the front door and meet with someone in your staff, or come talk with you, or they can go to a website or call you at an office, those are public accommodations. Any place that a member of the public could just come in with or without an appointment is going to be covered by that. So that's why we have these two pieces really highlighted here. Again, some of you might be in positions, excuse me, where you do something with state and local government programs, but in 1 hour, I tried to curtail this to the most unified information for all of you that I thought would be necessary. So moving here into the Title I application. Title I of the ADA covers employment discrimination. As I mentioned, there is a protection in here for small businesses. Title I really only applies to places of employment with 15 or more employees. So under 15, it does not apply in the same way. That doesn't mean you should discriminate against people, or that you should think of this as a, blank slate to do whatever you want, but the ADA only has those protections for 15 and more. Of course, I'll talk a little bit later about why I think, regardless of how many employees you have, having employees with disabilities is a benefit to you. But still, I have to cover this piece here that we're talking about people with 15 or more that it legally applies to. And the ADA protects discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. Interestingly, it also protects you if you do not have a disability, but are related to a person with a disability. So an example of that would be, let's say that I have a child with a disability and I apply for a job at your firm. Somehow through the grapevine, that I have a kid that has disabilities, maybe they have medical needs or things like that. If you decide, oh, well, I'm not going to hire Daniel to come work here. I know he's got a kid with disabilities. He's probably going to take a lot of sick leave. He's probably going to be out of town taking care of his kid. That discrimination is still prohibited under the ADA. So it not only protects the individual with a disability. Let's say that you either know or I disclose in part of the employment process that I have a disability. I'm of course protected under that. I'm also protected if my family member, child, spouse has a disability and you discriminate against me for that fact as well. So I always highlight that, one, because it's important in the employer context that you also can't do that. Again, hopefully not that any of you would, but it's nice to point out. But it's interesting that the ADA protects you even if you are not the person who has a disability yourself. So I'm not aware of a lot of other civil rights laws in the US that extend that protection. So just sort of an interesting factoid here that's how broad the ADA is, that even if you were only associated with someone with a disability, in the employment context, you could be protected from discrimination. So the question here, right, is it says right here that the ADA protects qualified individuals with a disability. So we have to split that out. And what is an individual with a disability and what does qualified mean? What is a disability is very broad under the ADA. So the ADA defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, a record of such an impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. So there's sort of three prongs that you could be qualified as an individual with a disability. We'll dive into this first one the most. That's the most common. So we will talk about major life activities and substantially limits on the next slide. Record of impairment is a situation a little bit like the first one. So let's say that I apply for a job, and through the neighborhood association or PTA or something that I used to have cancer and I'm in remission from cancer. 5 years ago, it was in the paper, I had a GoFundMe or something. If you know that I have a record of a disability like cancer, even if I'm in remission now, it's not affecting me now, I'm still protected. Again, you can't say, oh, I know that Van Sant guy, wasn't he the one that we had that GoFundMe and he had cancer, happy he's doing well now, but gosh, if it flares up again, that could really take him out of the office. That type of discrimination is also prohibited under the ADA. Similar things like diabetes, epilepsy, something where it might not affect me or an individual every minute of every day, but if there's a record of it and somehow or it's public knowledge, that's still protected as being a person with a disability. The third prong, the being regarded as, is also interesting to me, at least. Well, it's all interesting to me. Hopefully it's interesting to you as well. Being regarded as having an impairment means that you don't actually have a disability, but somehow you present that you do, or somebody thinks that you do. So let's say that I had a facial difference, right? Like my appearance was markedly different. You might see me at the grocery store and notice and think, oh, there's something different with this guy. There's something going on here. It might not actually affect any aspect of my life other than my appearance, meaning that I don't actually have a disability because it doesn't substantially limit one or more major life activities. But if you look at me and you think, oh, he's probably got something going on, there's something quote unquote wrong with him, even though I'm not disabled, you can't discriminate against me for that. So again, it's really, I think, powerful how expansive this law is to even go after those sort of attitudinal barriers that prevent people with disabilities from accessing our daily life. So we'll jump now into this first prong, a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. So this is how broad we are talking here. A major life activity, this is not an expansive, all-inclusive list, but caring for yourself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, working, right? Lots of verbs here. So many things that we do all the time can be qualified as a major life activity. So think of all of those and how many conditions or diagnoses could actually be considered a disability. And then we actually expanded that in 2008 to also include major bodily functions, which again is not a complete list here, but functions of the immune system, normal cell growth. I mentioned cancer. That's where cancer fits in here under cell growth. Digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, reproductive functions. So again, that's not even the full list, right? There's all of these major bodily major life activities and major bodily functions that are protected under the ADA. And so when you think about that, you start to understand why, I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting that disability is the largest minority population in our country. Somewhere between 15 to 25% of our country has some kind of disability. And a lot of times people think, well, that's like 1 in 4 people. That can't be right. That's a huge number of people. But when you look at this list, that starts to make a little bit more sense, right? Anybody that has something that affects their breathing, or when you start to include, diabetes, epilepsy, dyslexia, mental health conditions are covered in this as well, right? When you think about a physical or mental condition that affects your thinking, so OCD, PTSD, depression, anxiety, all of these types of conditions are protected under the ADA, which helps us to get to that large number of people that are actually protected by this law. And I think importantly, the law protects you even if you don't personally identify as someone with a disability. I'm sure we have almost 300 people here, right? Statistically, somewhere between 20% of people on this call have something that qualifies them on this list. Some of you hopefully have disabilities and think of yourself as having a disability and identify that way. That's great. Some of you probably have a disability and maybe have never thought about yourself as being disabled, right? You have diabetes, or you have cancer that's in remission, or something else that affects your breathing, your hearing, your vision, and maybe haven't thought, oh, I'm a disabled person. But even if you don't personally identify that way, the law still protects you from discrimination based on that. As I mentioned, you have to be a person with a disability, a qualified individual with a disability, right? So you have to have a disability. And again, we're still in Title I here. So we're still in that employment umbrella, or we're under the employment roof. I guess there's real estate agents here. We should use some housing metaphors. So do you have a disability, right? Step 1, under that first, second, third prong, are you a person with a disability? Next, we ask, are you qualified to do the work? So an individual with a disability is qualified to perform the work if they meet the skill, experience, education, or other requirements of an employment position, and who can perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodations. Again, it's not enough that you have a disability. You also have to show that with your disability, with or without reasonable accommodations, you can actually do the job that you are being hired for. So again, I work in the advocacy world, so I'm often talking to disabled people about advocating for their rights. But if I have to put on the employer hat here, you as a potential employer, you don't have to worry about, just because someone with a disability applies, you have to hire them, even if they're not the best candidate, because you don't want to get in trouble for discrimination. That's not what this is about. That person still has to be able to do the job, meet the essential functions, or perform the essential functions, sometimes with a reasonable accommodation, right? If we do XYZ, if we get this piece of technology, if we change your work site, can you still do the job? Yeah, then they can be protected. But you don't have to hire someone just because they have a disability and you're afraid of discriminating. They have to also be able to do the job. So the essential functions are really, what is the job actually doing? Not every single item that we put in a job description, right? Like, we've all been hired for jobs that say you have to be able to move 25 pounds or something like that. I don't know, maybe it's just the work that I've had. I've had a lot of jobs that allegedly required me to move 25 pounds where I didn't often move 25 pounds around. So is that really an essential function? For some jobs, it would be. And if I couldn't do that, then I probably can't do the essential function. But it's not enough to say, oh, well, in the job description, this task is listed. Is that something they're actually doing day to day? Like, is that something that could not be assigned to someone else? Is it really important for this position? Not just when this comes up once or twice a quarter, this person should be able to do that. So think about those essential functions. If the individual is qualified to perform essential job functions, except for limitations caused by a disability, the employer must consider whether the individual could perform these functions with a reasonable accommodation. Again, we'll talk about reasonable accommodations in a second, but so again, let's say that it actually is an essential function that I work the telephone, right? I'm at the front desk. Someone who maybe can't speak or can't hear or has some other disability that affects their ability to use the phone, are there other ways that we could do that, right? Like I get, I have a desk phone somewhere that actually shows you how little I use it because I can't. Okay, it's behind this pile of folders. That's how little I'm actually on my physical desk phone, as I didn't know where it was off the top of my head, because everything comes to me through my phone, right? My Teams comes to me. When I get a voicemail, it transcribes it to me. I can email or text or message people back. Could I still do the essential functions of manning the phones in your office with other technologies, or do I have to physically pick up the phone, be able to talk? And again, actually, for some people, let's take people who are deaf, for example. There are video relay services now where somebody on a landline phone calls a number, it pops up with a, like we're doing on Zoom here, an ASL, an American Sign Language interpreter on Zoom. I can communicate with them in sign language. They voice back through the phone to the customer. So in that case, someone who's deaf could still be your frontline worker on the phone, even though we might traditionally think that being able to hear a phone call would be an important function. So really think about some creative problem solving when it comes to those reasonable accommodations and other technologies as well. What is a reasonable accommodation? This is probably something you've all heard before, but of course we like to break it down a little bit. So reasonable accommodation, some examples include making existing facilities used by employees accessible, widening a door frame, putting a ramp on the front of your door. My desk, all of our desks here in our office are height adjustable. So regardless of if someone used a wheelchair or they were tall or wanted to stand or what have you, our furniture is height adjustable, things like that. Noise canceling headphones being provided in the office. I mentioned the video relay service, things like that. It can also mean appropriately modifying examinations, training, or other programs. I don't know all the specifics of what training you all go through. Obviously, there's licensing system. I had to get this training approved for some kind of credit. So I know that you have training and continuing ed programs and things like that. You may still need to make accommodations in those aspects to make sure that people have access to employment. A reasonable accommodation may include reassigning a current employee to a vacant position if they're also qualified for that position. If the person becomes disabled and is unable to do their original job, so that could be an option. But again, there's no obligation to find a position for an applicant who's not qualified for the position sought. So you as an employer are not required to lower your quality or your standards to make an accommodation or provide personal use items like glasses or hearing aids that you would use outside of the workplace as well. So again, don't think of this as, oh, we've had someone with a disability apply, we have to hire them and find something. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we want to make sure that you're actually hiring people who are qualified for the job and not doing it out of fear or charity or pity or something like that. Okay. Shifting now out of Title I. So we're going to take off your employer hat, mime taking the hat off here. The Title III hat that we're going to put on is you as a business owner of a physical space. And again, I don't know if this applies to all of you. I mean, there's, again, 300 people here. Several of you probably have a storefront somewhere. You've got a brick and mortar. You very likely have some kind of website that people find out about you, see your listings, things like that, right? So that's where we're sort of shifting gears to with this slide is your public accommodations. So if me as Daniel, right, I could go through the list of participants here and find one of you and I don't want to call someone's name and have you be like, oh, what's going on here? I don't know, Connie Julius, right? I could search Connie Julius realtor and see what properties you've got. Maybe I'm looking for a new place to buy or rent or what have you. I'm sure that if I Google any of you, you've got a business website. Some of you have a storefront. That's where we are. If I, as a general member of the public, could get there to interact with you, that's the public accommodation space. So outside of that, traditionally think of this as your stores, your movie theaters, your restaurants, anything like that that you just go to in your day-to-day life as a member of the general public. Those are your public accommodations. So the reason that your Casey's or your Hy-Vee has ramps and automatic doors or push buttons or, bathroom sinks at a certain height, that's all because of Title III of the ADA. There's very specific architectural guidelines. Again, I'm talking to realtors. I'm sure you are all very well versed in that. I'm not going to dive into that in a lot of detail because that's its own several hour long training about how wide door frames need to be and slopes of ramps and all those fun things to make spaces physically accessible. So if you have questions about that later, again, that might be a more one-on-one conversation depending on your space, but just know that those things apply to you. So your storefront, your office spaces need to be physically accessible for clients that could just come in. So think about what that would be. What does your space look like? What changes need to be made, if any? Maybe some of you have really accessible office spaces. I would love to hear about that as well. We always like to show best practices, as I mentioned. So if you have a space that does really well on this, reach out and see if there's something we can do to highlight that. It also covers your parking spaces, your entrances, door frames, your bathrooms. Is there a bathroom that I could come into your office and use if I was meeting with you to go over a deed or something? That bathroom should also be physically accessible. This also applies to communication. So without getting too far into the weeds, think about how you would prepare a deed or a real estate contract or a rental agreement for someone who is blind, right? Hopefully someone here has done that you've sold a house to a blind person and thought about how they can review a legally binding contract and file it, sign it, have informed consent of what they are signing. But think about making those types of publications accessible as well. I've been to, a lot of open houses before. How would you give an open house to someone who is deaf? Do you know where to book an American Sign Language interpreter? Do you have information about those types of accommodations on the listing if somebody needs that? Is your website of home listings accessible? Again, if I were just to Google any of you and go to your website and look at what properties you have open and try to buy something, if I were blind or dyslexic or had low vision or something like that, would I actually be able to get information off of your webpage? Is it accessible for a screen reader so that the information is accessible, or the photos, right? I, like many people, whether out of seriousness or just morbid curiosity, spend a decent amount of time on Zillow just looking at what's going on in my neighborhood. And we all click through the 45 pictures that people take with fisheye lenses and things. Are they described? If I were blind, right, would I know, well, this is 3-bedroom, 2-bath? I might have some of those measurements and those, written out pieces. But are the images described? Does it actually tell me what the countertops look like or what the backsplash is? Or, it says 2 bathrooms. Would I be able to tell without vision what those bathrooms were like, what the toilets looked like, what the bathtub or the shower looked like? So these are all accessibility concerns to think about going forward, so that customers have access to what you're selling, right? That the title today is the value proposition. So I don't always like to phrase this as, if your website's inaccessible, someone could sue you, or if your office is inaccessible, someone could sue you. I mean, that's not untrue, but trying to shift that thought to, right, I mentioned somewhere around 15, 20, 25% of the population has a disability. That's a huge customer base for you. That's 20% of Iowans that at some point will likely try to become homeowners. And if your website is the accessible one, if your office is the accessible one, if I can tell from your website that your phone number will route me through an American Sign Language interpreter, you will get my business, right? If I see that you are taking attempts to market to me as a consumer, I will go with you over a competitor. Now there's 301 people on this call, so I would love to hear that we spark some kind of accessible arms race between all of you of who can sell the most houses to disabled people. But think about it like that, not just the law tells you have to do this, so I don't want to get in trouble. Think about the customers, the consumers, the commissions that you're leaving out there because somebody couldn't go to your website and see what you're selling. Talking with business owners, I also like to highlight here that there are tax credits and deductions available for you as business owners. So let's say, right, I just mentioned, what does your entrance look like? You might go, maybe you're in the office today, maybe you'll go to the office later and think, okay, actually, there's a couple steps going into the front of our office. The door might not be wide enough for someone in a wheelchair. I just saw this presentation this morning about how many millions of dollars of disabled income are out there to spend on housing, and I want to make my front door accessible for my business. There are actual tax credits and deductions to benefit small business owners here. I am not an accountant. Again, I'm not your lawyer, so I would encourage you to work with your legal team, your accounting team, to discuss the application of this for your circumstance, but just know that these things are out there so that you could talk with your accountant or your business attorney about Section 190 of the IRS code, what would apply, how do you go through that process, but know that that's out there. We don't just put these requirements on businesses and say, good luck. There are some tax credits and deductions to help you proactively do this before someone would come and slap your wrist with an inaccessible lawsuit or something like that. I'll mention briefly the Fair Housing Act just because of the audience that I've got today. Again, this is probably something I have not practiced a lot under the Fair Housing Act, so I don't want to dive too much into that. You all are likely more well-versed in it than I am, actually, but of course, whether renting or buying, the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination due to a variety of identities, including disabilities, in all housing transactions. It's got that same definition as the ADA, so people with mental or physical impairments that substantially limit one or more major life activities. So know that even if we're not in ADA world, that the Fair Housing Act, right, some of you probably work on rental properties too, I have to assume, that you represent large complexes and things like that. So know that the Fair Housing Act also, something to consider here. Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit more now into the what does disability look like? Why should this matter to you outside of the here's our legal, our legal scare tactic here. So this is a breakdown here from the CDC of what disability actually looks like in the US. So notice on these percentages here, this focuses on those major life activities, right? So we focus down here at the bottom on what are those life activities that you struggle with because of a disability rather than a diagnosis. My assumption is when you got an email that said we'd be talking about disability, maybe a lot of you were thinking, like, the first thing that comes to mind is wheelchairs. We've got people in wheelchairs, people who are blind, maybe some of these more traditional thoughts of what a disability is. If I say a disabled person, what do you picture, right? But if we look at this data, we see that actually the largest percentage of disability is going to be in that mental health arena, which are things that you cannot see. So this is just another reminder of, you know, with the percentage of people in our state, in our country that have disabilities, right? I could scroll through all the videos of people here, and I may or may not be able to tell by looking at a little thumbnail of you, do you have some kind of disability? But think of how many of these disabilities are completely invisible. I would not be able to tell by looking at any of you if you have bipolar disorder or depression, anything like that, right? So that's just kind of a reminder of, be cognizant that a lot of people with disabilities are probably in your day-to-day life, and maybe they haven't disclosed that to you, but just know, as you're thinking about disability, it's not always the things that we can see. So we also want to be cognizant of how we talk about disability, how we think about it, because it could affect someone in your office and you wouldn't even know it based on appearance alone. So why does this matter, right? I've gone about 40 minutes here without maybe selling that to you, if I haven't sold it to you at this point. Why does disability matter to you? Why did your association reach out to have this training? Why are we talking about this today? So first, think about disability as being intersectional. I mentioned statistically, roughly, what do we have, 300 people here. So what, 20 to 25, 30, 60 people on this video today statistically have some type of disability. So it affects us in this literal call right now, as a percentage of you likely have a disability. A number of you probably have family members that have a disability. Maybe when I read those things off, you thought of a niece or a nephew or an uncle or a grandparent or a parent or something like that. So think about how prevalent and close disability actually is in your life and in your business. And then also know that if you don't have a disability today, statistically, you will have one at some point in your life if you live long enough. Every person develops a disability by illness, accident, or old age at some point in your life, right? So not that I want to put any negative thoughts out there, but you could be in a car accident today and have a disability tomorrow going forward. You could get sick and have some permanently disabling condition starting, tomorrow or next week. You could fall down and develop a disability. Or as you get older, I'm not aware of a lot of people that make it too far into old age without developing some type of condition that affects their ability to move, hear, see, eat, right? Everybody becomes disabled at some point if you live long enough. And so when we think about this globally, 3.4 billion people on our planet have a disability or are a close familial or friend relationship to a person with a disability. So this isn't just, oh, he's going to talk to us about, there's someone with a wheelchair who wants to buy a house in, I don't know, Creston. When we think about nationally, internationally, this is a massive, massive global population. When we think of 3.4 billion people, that is the population of China and the European Union put together, right? And as business owners, business leaders, right, there's not a lot of companies that are not trying to do business with China, right? That's a massive, massive consumer base for people to sell product to. So think of a population as big as the European Union and China together and ask, is that something that you want to make sure has access to buying from you? Because if not, I guess that's a personal choice you're making as a business owner, but you're leaving a lot of consumers out of buying or renting your properties. Globally, those 3.4 billion people have a spending power of $13 trillion with a T. Again, it's really hard to conceptualize what $13 trillion is, but hopefully all of you as business leaders can understand that that's a tremendous amount of money that has to go somewhere. And shouldn't you be the place that they're buying from? Why would you want to not have access to that population? If we take this domestically alone, in the United States, only people with disabilities, so not our family members, friends, coworkers, just people with disabilities control $645 billion in disposable income, not total, right, economic power, disposable income of $645 billion in the US alone. So think about this. I don't know if I've successfully beat this this dead horse enough, but think about that. Think about the people in your neighborhoods, in your cities, with that disposable income out there that would buy a property from you, but can't if their real estate agent is not accessible, if the house is not accessible, which we'll get to in a second. Again, I don't want to belabor this point too much, but inclusive companies, companies that are inclusive of disability, have been found to be twice as likely to have higher shareholder returns, 28% higher revenue, and 30% higher profit margins than their peers, as done in a study by Accenture from 2018, I believe. So again, I just mentioned, if out of, well, now we're down to 299. I lost somebody on my on my diatribe here. Of 299 of you, I have to believe there's dozens of real estate entities here. If you were the accessible one and your competitor is not, that $645 billion of domestic disposable income flows to you and not your competitor, which is where we get these statistics around how much higher performing companies that are inclusive of disability are. A really good way to make sure that you're inclusive as well is to hire people with disabilities and to have that in your workforce. So think about that with other forms of diversity as well, right? I mean, I'm guessing you want to sell a house, right? And it probably doesn't matter too much to you personally what that person looks like, what their beliefs or orientation or anything is. A sale is a sale, right? You want that property moved. But again, I guess I can use myself as an example. If I can go through your website and see that you have realtors or staff that look like me, have experiences like I do, am I going to be more likely to buy from you? So think about that inclusion at all levels of your venture, right? From what's public facing to your internal policies and employment practices as well. I have a nice little factoid down here about the innovative power of disability. So if you have listened to an audiobook this week, if you've used a power or like an electric toothbrush, cruise control, the keyboard on your cell phone or the computer that you logged in on, those are all things that were created by or for people with disabilities. And they're all inventions that have tremendously shaped our society. And I mean, not more importantly, I've got my business facing hat on. The companies that take advantage of these make money, right? The companies that came up with Siri and Amazon, Alexa, and things like that took an item geared toward disability, and now it's something that has mass appeal. Every one of you uses a keyboard probably hundreds or thousands of times a day. You're probably texting a coworker right now that's like, when is this guy gonna stop talking about the market share of disability? Or you logged in on a keyboard to get here, and that comes from disability. So think about you as a business owner, what you could be missing out on by not having someone with that sort of creative problem solving instinct of a disabled person on your staff. Okay, wanted to include some facts and figures here from a recent Freddie Mac study. So this is actually March 2023, which is as recent as I could find it for the purpose of our training today. So 47% of renters with disabilities say that their current residence is not at all or is minimally accessible. 36% of renters with disabilities that require accommodations won't be able to make those renovations in their rental property. And 62% of those with disabilities, regardless of if they rent or own, believe that they will age in place, but less than half of renters prefer to stay in their current home with 52% saying that they would rather buy a home. So again, think of these numbers of how many people with disabilities are likely renting right now that would buy homes and are looking to buy homes if these types of accessibility features and things were available to them. So again, think about the customers that you are not interacting with, that you are not capturing based on these statistics. And what does that look like, right? What does this look like in a single family dwelling, in a house, right? The respondents of that study identified the top 5 features that would make it easier for them to live in their current home, which I think we can extrapolate to what would make purchasing a home more appealing to them if they had these things. I think we can kind of draw that conclusion of, this is what I wish I had in my rental property that I can't do because I don't own that property. So 48% of people needed bathroom aids. 36% were looking for a single-story home. 36% wanted a home security system, something very basic that we maybe wouldn't have thought of as a disability feature. 34% of people want entrance without steps. 33% want electrical outlets positioned slightly higher or slightly lower than standard. So I point these things out to you, again, not being in the real estate business. I have to assume you are also all interfacing with contractors, right? You are probably helping people flip properties. And I have seen, like I said, I have done a fair number of looking at, open houses and touring homes, especially during the pandemic. I have seen houses that were flipped in the pandemic and done poorly. I'm sure no one here was involved. I'm not going to say where. But the next time that you are working with an owner who wants to renovate and flip, think about these things. Is there something we can do in that to make the bathroom more accessible, to make a walk-in shower, to have bars around things? Is there a way that we can slope the steps, right? Stuff like that that actually could open up the consumer base for this house or this property and make it more appealing for people. I'll move to this next slide while continuing that conversation because of this survey piece here. I mentioned all of you will be personally affected by disability at some point in your life. So don't forget that piece. But look at this survey here. So this was from US News and World Reports. Again, a 2023 survey of 2,000 people age 55 and over. And of those 2,000 people, a majority of respondents, 93%, say that aging in place is an important goal for them, right? 93% of us want to age in our own homes as long as possible. That's probably not a shocking statistic. I don't know a lot of people that are really excited to move into assisted living or a nursing home, or can't wait to not live in their own privately owned house anymore, right? We want to be in our houses as long as possible. 59% of those people feel that their home is somewhat ready, and only 19% feel that their current home setup is completely prepared for the years ahead. So again, look at that disconnect there of 93% of people 55 and older say it's important that they stay in their own home as long as possible, but only 19% think that their current property is able to accommodate that. So something that makes me think of is, we'll make this maybe a little interactive here in our last couple minutes. With a big crowd, this is hard, but can we get like a show of electronic or physical hands? How many of you have a bathroom in your house, which is one of those, like it's a bathtub that you get into and stand to use your shower? How many of you have one of those in your bathroom? Okay, I'm getting a lot of hands. Yeah, electronic and I don't know, regular, non-electronic hands. Right. So lots of people here have a bathroom where you step up into a bathtub to take a shower. I don't need a ton of personal information, but of you that have that set up as your shower, how many of you have taken a bath in that bathtub in the last I don't month, 2 months, 6 months, maybe you've never taken a bathtub or been taking a bath in that bathtub, but that's the standard construction for a lot of home bathrooms, right? You might say, yeah, that's actually really good for bathing kids. When you had little kids, you put them in the bathtub and that's how they got clean. Great. That's probably why we have that as a standard practice. But at what point will that bathtub alone make your house unsafe for you personally, right? There is a point in your life where you not being able to get into that bathtub safely to take your shower every day will cause you to have to seek somewhere else to live or to redo your entire bathroom. But then that's the standard construction, right? I toured a lot of homes in the pandemic. Not very many had the sort of walk-in shower. That would be the more universally designed way to do this, right? I looked at a property. I have a physical disability that affects my balance and my ability to walk and get around. And, beautiful house, like the first floor was redone really nice. Everything looked great. We go upstairs and it's like, okay, kind of rickety wood steps. We'd have to do something for some traction on here. That's easy. There's those like sticky pads I can put down. And then I get to the bathroom and there's like this beautiful old clawfoot bathtub. And in the photos, this looks beautiful, right? And again, not to be too personal, I love a good bath. Like I'll take a good bath if I can. The thought of using a high-walled clawfoot tub every morning to get ready for work is very dangerous for me. I don't know how many days I would make it before I actually fell in that bathtub. So I couldn't even seriously consider this house because my immediate first step would be, this is not move-in ready for me until I would get this bathroom redone, which adds so much expense on top of that. So think about these statistics and these pieces as you are working with people listing houses. Is there something we can do quickly to make those things more accessible so that people can age in their home appropriately? Think about that step, right? I mean, I grew up in a ranch style house with 2 concrete steps that went into the front door. Great. That's fine for most people. Probably don't ever think about that. What about when you're leaving the house with, your kid in a stroller, right? And you have to bump up the stairs and hold the door open and get inside. Not good for pushing those things when you're carrying your groceries and you have to look around to make sure you don't trip up the stairs. Or again, when you get older, 2 steps prevents you from safely getting in your house. So just think about that as you're working with people listing properties. Of if you're going through the trouble of flipping, rehabbing, whatever you're doing to the property, are there things like this that you could make it universally designed so it would be more appealing to people with disabilities today or people who are getting older and thinking about buying a home that they want to age in place, right? That's sort of my call to action for you. Is I would love to start seeing more listings where it's clear that somebody thought about these things in redoing the house. If you're doing new construction right now or flipping some old houses, there's no reason we can't add some of these features to just make it a little bit more accessible for people. I know we're running really low on time here, so the last thing that I want to talk about is we mentioned disability as part of broader DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion issues, as a conversation that's really at the forefront of a lot of people's minds these days. And think about disability cutting through every single one of them, right? Disability does not exist in a vacuum. Nobody is just their disability as a aura, right? There's not like a spirit orb of disability. Like we have bodies with these other intersecting identities as well. So if you in your professional context or, as a business owner or looking to sell to different populations, think about how disability cuts through every age, race, gender, social, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, income level, everything. Anyone can become disabled. It's not tied to any other metric. So if you are marketing to and accessible for people with disabilities, by default, you are marketing to people of every other identity as well. And so think about that in terms of the most bang for your buck in reaching out to diverse populations, to seeking diverse employees. Think about disability as opening the door to broader amounts of diversity as well. I will be able to send this out afterwards, so don't feel like you have to, take a picture or capture this. I told you I was going to give you some resources of where you can go from here. So I've attached from ada.gov has an ADA update for a primer for small businesses. So some really helpful tips and tricks in there about if you're a small business owner, how you can implement pieces of the ADA. The Great Plains ADA Center is a free technical assistance resource. The Great Plains office is the one that covers Iowa, so I included their website specifically. You can call them for questions, concerns, leads on contractors that could help you make a space more accessible and what that actually looks like. And then this is an Iowa-specific guide to universal home design. So if I've really moved you all to think about incorporating some of these accessible and universal design features in the houses that you flip and sell or build or work on, I provided a guide there for you to start talking with your contractors about what that looks like and where we can start. Okay, it's 11:01, and I just hit my last slide, so I feel like I successfully filled an hour of curriculum for all of you to get your credit, if nothing else. This is information about how you can follow us. If you found this interesting and want to engage with our work, please follow us at your preferred social media site here. We do trainings, webinars, conferences. We publish reports all the time about disability and these issues. And so if this is something that you want to be more engaged with, please follow us here, come to our events, read the reports that we put out, and welcome to this journey of making our world a little bit more accessible. I will stop there because I know some of you probably have to leave. And I mean, I'm not in control of the sign in and the credit and stuff, but our hour is done. So you are free to go. I did say that I'm happy to make myself available here for questions. So I'll pause and let Greta or